Thank you, Phil, for that very, very generous welcome. Right, I'll begin with a thank you or two and a couple of acknowledgements. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I feel quite spoilt. I was quite taken aback when I entered the hotel on Wednesday, when was it? Monday evening. It's beautiful. And that was confirmed when I saw the size of the bath, which I promptly used. So as far as academic conferences go, we don't get spoiled like this. So thank you for that. It's also terrific to meet a new bunch of people and a new network and understand what another group of people are working on and trying to achieve. And I've certainly learned an awful lot over the last 48 hours about registered training authorities, the role of the industry skills councils, etc., and it seems to me that there's a lot of parallels between the challenges that you face as a community and the challenges that my sector faces in the higher education sector, particularly with fee deregulation looking likely. So that's the thank yous. A couple of acknowledgements. The first is to my colleague, Mr. Keith Sue, who worked with me on this project and did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the interviews. So he's acknowledged at the back of the presentation as well. And finally to ActuAGL, who funded this research. ActuAGL has an endowment at the ANU which spawns about $100,000 a year, which we can apply for to do some projects. And in their wisdom, they recognised that our idea to explore the potential applications and benefits of distributed energy storage in the ACT might be worth looking at. And so this is how this project came about. And now a favour to ask. I have a tendency to get carried away and lose track of time. So when we get to the 20-minute mark, if someone could just wave frantically and tell me to shut up, that would be fantastic. So where am I looking? Here. Distributed energy storage in the ACT. I'm going to focus particularly on where energy storage is at the moment, internationally but also domestically, what the potential benefits of storage may be, where the challenges are in being able to integrate this new technology into the national electricity market, and finally just a few brief words on what all of that might mean in relation to the types of skills and training that our young, or maybe not so young, people are going to need within the energy sector in the coming 5, 7, 10 years or so. But a lot of that was dealt with yesterday, so I won't labour the point. So, Frank Calabria said just last year, technology will disrupt. I think we have underestimated the rate of onset, not just of solar PV, but PV with combination of storage as a greater disruption potential. That's not too far away. Now that was in Australia just last year, and certainly the presentations that we saw yesterday confirmed for me that distributed energy storage is definitely on our radar. Naturally, perhaps, developments are most progressed, if you like, elsewhere in the world, specifically Germany and California. Germany has a $25 million scheme, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things, but I think is at least a signal, to cover up to 30% of residential storage costs. So if you're a household in Germany and you want to try energy storage, you can apply for your 30% rebate under this national scheme. The California Public Utilities Commission now has a mandate for no less than 1,325 megawatts of grid storage by 2020. The vast majority of that will not be at the residential scale. It will be for industrial and commercial buildings. And if you have a look at that graph on the right, you'll see that the market for storage technologies in 2012 was about 200 million, but it's projected to be 19 billion by 2017. So if you're a betting man or woman, I'd be putting some money into distributed energy storage companies. Certainly if that graph is to be believed. Again, not in Australia, but in New Zealand, there's a utility called Vector, where are my two New Zealanders down there, who are trialling an asset operation and maintenance leasing arrangement whereby they lease the storage asset to the household and then they enter into a contract with those households to maintain those assets over time. All right? This is a fundamental shift away from your traditional utility business model, but I'll come back to that. Clearly, the potential for distributed energy storage is very closely linked to the proliferation of renewable energy more generally. Right? They go hand in hand. And again, if you have a look in Germany, which is leading the way on this, as my German husband constantly points out to me, you'll see that the cost for electricity, levelized cost of electricity, where you have PV plus solar and with the EE, which is their sort of rebate system, if you like, will be lower than your traditional levelized cost of electricity from traditional sources very soon. Right? So the cost profile of this is getting more and more attractive with every quarter that passes. Okay? So in my mind, this would be like me giving this presentation on solar PV 10 years ago. Right? I might have been saying similar things. Look, guys, the cost profile around PV panels is changing, and we're going to see a massive proliferation of it. That would have been about right 10 years ago. I'm now saying this around distributed storage technologies. And so we can see from the graph on the right that the diffusion of residential scale PV in the NEM has taken off. Not as much as elsewhere, but certainly residential, we're leading the way. In total terms, not so much, but residential we are. So if we agree, and I think generally we do, that storage technologies go hand in hand with the penetration of PV, then we're likely to see the proliferation of storage sooner rather than later. Now, when we think about what this might mean, you have to really, I'm a political scientist, right? So I boil things down to one question, really. Who are the winners and who are the losers? Right? If we imagine a future where we have very extensive PV or wind or other renewable energy penetration and a world of storage, who's likely to win from that? Who's likely to lose from that? And as we shift to that world, in that transition period where it looks like it's going to happen, but we can't be absolutely certain, in that period, who's bearing the risk that what you think is going to happen with this technology, in this case storage, doesn't necessarily happen? Right? And understanding where those risks are and who bears those risks is really, really critical when we think about how to facilitate and enable and support that transition to that new world that Danny Kennedy described so compellingly yesterday. So this brought us to the project. And we were really interested in two things. The first was, well, what are the applications for distributed energy storage in our existing electricity sector? And when I say applications, I mean inherent in that is the benefits from it. Once we've ascertained whether or not there are benefits from the adoption of distributed energy storage technologies, does our current institutional framework enable us to exploit those benefits? Or are there a whole lot of impediments in the system which mean that we can't take it on board as quickly as we might like to? The other way of putting that is, what is it about Germany and California that makes them so ready to adopt innovative solutions? And what makes our system a little bit slower on the uptake? So we looked at it specifically in relation to the ACT. This isn't our matrix, this is some American scholars who essentially mapped the 17 potential applications of distributed energy storage in an electricity sector. And you can see that there are categories of applications around electric supply, ancillary services, the grid system, and within that sort of transmission support and the like. There's benefits for the end user, the customer. And then, of course, the one that everyone sort of rushes to very quickly is its role in supporting the integration of renewable energy technologies in our existing system. So there are those 17 applications. And essentially what we did was say, well, looking at the ACT, which admittedly is kind of unique, and I say that even though I recognize I am biased, I do love Canberra, despite what everyone said when I moved there. We were able to identify a number of applications from this list which have high potential in the ACT's profile, and those which also have low potential, but which, when aggregated, make it a fairly compelling argument for us to be looking at it. So the high potential applications are essentially around renewable time shift, so being able to deal with that intermittent supply, generation capacity of renewable energies. And that definitely is likely to have the single biggest benefit, at least in the ACT region. A second is around voltage control, again related to that high penetration of PV technology. And then the third is augmentation deferral. That's a crappy way of saying it, but if you introduced storage, perhaps that would mean that you could defer the construction of traditional poles and wires. And so I would refer you perhaps to the CEO of Ergon in Queensland, who said just 4 months ago, I'm not going to spend money extending the grid into rural and regional Queensland. Right? I don't need to anymore. We now have renewable energy combined with storage, which gives us a degree of energy security and sovereignty, which removes the need to expand your existing pole and wire network. So they're the three high potential applications of storage in the ACT. Then there's a raft of low potential applications. Reliability is not a compelling argument for storage in the ACT because we already have a strongly reinforced network. Reactive power is not a large issue as it's a small network without industrial loads, but clearly that value proposition changes when you're looking at a different case study other than the ACT. And time of use costs are a small proportion of total costs, so that's unlikely to be a major benefit. So really what we came to was you've got to focus on the important high potential applications, which is the three on the previous slide. Yes, there are these lower potential applications, and individually in and of themselves, perhaps they don't make a compelling case, but once you put them together, once you aggregate them and you say, gosh, just one technology can actually trigger 7 or 8 benefits, then the value proposition for the technology gets a lot stronger. So we had a fairly, I think, promising story to tell ActuAGL in relation to why they ought to pursue the potential of distributed storage. We then had to say, so let's say you wanted to. Right? What's stopping you? Right? Why are we not already jumping on this bandwagon? So in order to assess and critique that aspect of the research proposal, we had to develop an analytical framework unique to the energy sector in Australia. Excuse me. And so we had 4 subsectors, obviously generation, transmission, distribution, and retail, and then 5 what we call regimes, which classic academic wanky talk, but essentially it's, what are the different types of issues that we're likely to face or hit or have to jump over within those 4 subsectors. And so we have the socio-cultural aspect. Right? Is there something that's unique or embedded within our culture that says, actually, we're not ready for this now? Is it the governance arrangements, the regulatory arrangements? And the short answer is yes, it is. Are there commercial imperatives that mean this isn't doable right now? Are there technical issues? And I would include things like recognition of skills and training and whether or not we have the right people who understand the technology as it is today. And then there's the security issues. So we dissected each of these regimes and found a number of different things. The first is that amenity is a particularly interesting issue in the ACT, and I suspect that's because of the profile of the Canberra region. So where infrastructure is placed, what it looks like, the potential for us to avoid any of the nasty looking pieces of infrastructure that tend to come with fossil fuel plants and the like was very significant in Canberra residents' thinking. There's a relatively large level of support for renewable generation in Canberra. I was talking to my colleague from the ACT government. I think they banked on 1,700 households taking up the feed-in tariff for renewables in the ACT. I was one of them, but it turned out that actually they ended up having 13,000 households sign up to it. Right? They just completely underestimated the willingness and the financial ability of Canberra residents to adopt PV. What does this mean for storage? Well, of course, it means that those of us that have panels on our roofs are more likely to say, let's go the extra step. Let's have the battery in the garage and see if we can really work this system. All right? And again, German husband, he happens to be an engineer as well. So his dream is that we would in fact be energy sovereign and water sovereign, God help me. But of course, this kind of technology makes that more and more feasible. However, there is deeply embedded in the mindset of the national electricity market, the people within it who work in it, the people who govern it and manage it, there is a very deeply entrenched resistance for change. Right? And that's probably not surprising. We're talking about an industry that has 30 or 40 years for its infrastructure, lifespan. Right? So once you've done it, you've got to stick with it for 30 or 40 years. That tends to produce a very high level of inertia within those people that operate in that system. Right? But I would argue that when we think about storage, you can say, well, there's been a bit of a softening, if you like, because the same industry has had to deal with the penetration of renewables over the last 10 years. So there's a shift in thinking. Within the governance regime, there's a number of opportunities, but also impediments. Action Plan 2 for the ACT, Action 6 of the AP2 has a trial for storage along with smart grids and a variety of other different things. Again, I think the ACT is quite progressive in its willingness to try new things, and of course we'll hear this afternoon that we have not just a progressive but incredibly aggressive target for renewable energy generation in the coming decades. However, for all the good stuff and the target setting and the motivation, there are a number of impediments. One is that we actually identified that you need to have support either from government or from ActU-AGL to prove the technology. There was a lot of resistance amongst the people that we spoke to around whether or not the technology was actually commercially ready. Right? Is it a case of popping down to Bunnings in the next 12 months and saying, I'll have that one, please? Or are we much further away? Is it likely to work? And those that we spoke to from within the technology companies that make and manufacture batteries, they said nobody trusts us at the moment that this is likely to work. And in order for that trust to be developed, you need to have companies within the sector say, okay, we'll take a punt on you, show us it works. Right? And that's where pilot projects are so important. There are legislative concerns around the use of storage by distribution network service providers. Right? So if you've stored it up, does that then make it another generator? Right? You've stored your electricity in this battery. Does that battery then discharging that electricity, for instance, for commercial gain for the DNSP, what does that mean? How is that governed within the system? And of course, there's difficulty around registration in ancillary markets. The commercial regime threw up some really interesting issues which are going to need to be overcome and addressed if storage is to be integrated into the NEM. Chief among them was the tension with the business models of DNSPs. So if you go with storage, there's As I said before, the augmentation, the deferral of augmenting your infrastructure, your poles and wires, which is capital expenditure. Right? If you go with the storage option, then you're less likely to have to spend on big capital works. And the problem here is that the way the regulatory arrangement is designed is that an organization like ActuAGL can claim full cost recovery on capital expenditure with a margin, so they can make money on it. But they can't do the same for operating expenses. Of course, when we shift to distributed anything, we're really talking about operational expenses, maintenance. Right? We're moving away from that big, expensive, concrete in the ground model. Right? That is a profound impediment because, of course, you're undercutting the business model of the existing system. And there's uncertainty around well, whether or not we're going to bring in more dynamic pricing and what that might do for people's capacity to play with their storage technologies and their renewable energy technologies to take advantage of that. I think the presentation we had yesterday from Dr. Pratt was quite instructive. If people can't, 54% of Australia's population can't figure out that simple graph, are they really going to be able to get the benefits of renewable generation, storage, dynamic pricing, smart grids? Right? I suspect not, unless we're going to train every household in the country to be able to do it. But it does, on the other hand, present an incredible opportunity for DNSPs to rethink what their service delivery model is. Technical regime, and I suspect this is where you know more than I do. As I said, there's a lack of a deep understanding of the technology. Again, our interviews were predominantly with ActuAGL employees, but also AMO, the Standing Committee on Energy and Resources, so a number of policy wonks as well. Across the board, there was, oh yeah, storage, yeah, kind of know what it is, it's battery, right? But that's as far as it went, which is fair enough, to be honest. There's a lack of trust, which I mentioned, because they haven't had the opportunity to prove it. There's no defined technical standards or connection processes. So that needs to be overcome, otherwise you're never going to get it connected. And there's no streamlined processes similar to renewable energy systems. Again, though, if I were giving this speech 10 years ago about renewable energy, I probably would have been saying much the same thing. So it's about awareness and then a readiness to fix it. And then there's the security regime. And without a doubt, the entire national electricity market has been designed with security in mind, security of supply. Right? Never mind efficiencies, never mind sustainability. It's about making sure that those electrons get to where they're supposed to get to when you need them. Right? And of course, that's what we've demanded of them. That very much reinforces the sociocultural regime that I mentioned at the beginning, right? This idea that everything we do, all the strategies we think about in relation to the electricity market, must have as their primary objective security of supply. And so if you design a system with that in mind and you entrench it, and all your regulatory and institutional arrangements reinforce it, then the idea that you would have something that could be potentially disruptive, not necessarily destructive, but disruptive, it doesn't fit, right? What's that expression? Square, round hole, square peg? Square hole, round peg? Something like that. So understanding in the security regime, it's really about understanding who is it that takes the risk. The risk here is, who is it that takes the risk that security of supply will be interrupted? In this case, at the moment, the way it's currently designed, the risk is held by distribution network service providers like ActuAGL and AMO. So we're actually asking a lot of them if we want them to not just dip their toe in the water, but put their whole leg in the water and say, let's run with storage and see what happens. Right? Because if it doesn't work, they bear the risk. And that ultimately is about culture. but you knew I was going to say that because Phil introduced me as a political scientist. So the challenges. We need to focus on the regulatory regime and those commercial issues that I mentioned. There's a very high level of fragmentation amongst the people that we spoke to about whether storage had potential, where it was at in its innovation cycle, and who bears the risk and what those risks might be. So addressing those fragmented concerns within the different, or between the different stakeholders is critical. Household connection maintenance and installation concerns need to be addressed. You know, much of that can be done around a desk with the key DNSPs and the AMO and the SCER sitting around a table. And I would argue, and this is what we said to the management of Act2AGL, that if they really want to get ahead of the curve, and I think they do, which is why they commissioned the work, then they've got to get one step ahead of their competitors around what their new business model will need to embrace. And for my money, it's around leasing assets, maintenance of assets, unique, customized, individual service to your household. Right? And I think Danny alluded to that yesterday morning when he was talking about the way Sungevity operationalizes its business. Right? It was very personal. And I suspect that the more distribution we have at the household level, the more your traditional Act2AGLs and the like are going to have to say, oh crap, it's no longer a case of just building poles and wires and sending electrons down and hoping for the best. It's, you know, we're going to pull up our sleeves and frankly be a little bit more people-person friendly, which will require a whole different skill set. So how do we innovate? We've got to address the strategic vision and overcome the utility culture. A lot of the technology, battery technology people that we spoke to, who've been in the game now for 10 years. They've started with a technology that didn't really work. They piloted it, a whole lot of research and development. Then they did a commercial pilot, and now they have a technology that's pretty much commercial ready. They complained that it was phenomenally difficult to be trusted within the industry. And I think this quote is really salient. There are only about 1,000 people in the industry, so everyone knows each other, and if you're not known, you're not trusted. And there's another quote I'll come back to in a moment. Government support's critical to build that trust, and you can't depend on rule changes alone. I mean, you can't just have a target and hope to God that that'll work. There are a whole lot of technical and regulatory issues that need to be overcome that I've alluded to. The question that we asked AGL was, well, they asked us, was how do we survive? And the options are fairly limited if this new paradigm takes off. Increased fixed charges, pretty politically unpalatable. Stop people moving off grid. Good luck with that. All right. My background for many years was in water trading, water pricing and trading, and for a time we had what was called exit fees, so that if a farmer wanted to sell up all of his water entitlements and move to the city or move to another more profitable part of regional Australia, he could sell his entitlements. Please do, sell your entitlements. But you know what? We're going to tax you. And it was called an exit fee, right? Because we don't want you to leave that township. And you can imagine how that went down. Very unpalatable. Move the risks to another party. Right, so you could potentially, if you're Act2AGL or similar, you could say, okay, I'm going to start up a third-party company. We're going to run with that for a little while, but we'll hedge our bets. Are you waving madly yet? 5 more minutes. Excellent. Again, potential, I think, is in filling a role as an equipment installer and a maintainer, although you need to address issues around ownership. Right? Personally, I think 20 years from now, I'm going to be buying my energy generator and storage facility at Bunnings. Right? I think that's where it's going. If you're particularly savvy, if you're married to a German engineer, then that's probably going to work for you. Okay? But there's still going to be a need for companies to be able to do this for the 54% of the population that can't read a graph. Okay? That's, I think, gold. And it might not necessarily be the DNSPs. It could be an entrepreneur who comes in and says, okay, I'm going to do the shop to Bunnings for you. I'm going to install it. I'm going to maintain it. I'm going to have a fantastic web app that tells you everything you want to know about how much you're generating and what you're paying and yada, yada, yada. And it's all going to be very sexy, right? And that's for busy people who don't want to manage it themselves. There's a huge opportunity, I think, there for entrepreneurs in that space. And ultimately, if you want to get the head of the game, you've got to be pretty nimble. So what do we know? Storage is here. And I think considering the risk, who bears the risk is critical. Most difficulties extend from how we handle innovation per se. None of the issues I have spoken to are unique to storage technologies. Innovating is difficult, from the original idea through to research and development, through to making it commercial ready, to actually then inserting it into your existing regulatory, institutional and technical regime, right? It's just difficult. I think residential storage will require adjustment of business models, and I think there are a number of companies already talking about it. I mentioned Aragon Energy, Actu is obviously thinking about it. And there's a role for government here, although my interviews with the federal government particularly were quite revealing. They quite rightly are not in the business of backing particular technologies, because that's a risk for them. So what they're interested in is getting the policy settings right, so that whichever technology happens to take over or prove most valuable and cost effective is enabled, can flourish, right? But the government is not in the business of backing particular technologies, quote unquote. So I think points for discussion for this forum are, in this transition, there are going to be new skills required. I think there's going to be, and I'm not talking about apprenticeships here, I'm talking at the strategic level. What we found was that the senior management of Actu and other organisations were all over this. Yep, bring it on, new future, want to think about it, what do I got to do? Got to go to Germany, see how they're doing it. And then the next band were just, oh God, please don't come near me with innovation. Right? I'm having enough trouble as it is trying to do my current job in the hours available. Right? Don't tell me the world is changing, I just got to grips with this world. Right? That band of employees is going to need to either have their eyes opened and embrace change, or quietly be shown the door over the coming decade. And then you get the next level, which is actually operationalizing the technology. And that's where you've got to have the skills. You've got to know which battery, how does this battery work? Which battery is going to be appropriate in this situation? Where do I put it? Right? All the numbers that go with it. You'll notice I'm being vague. Right? That's the area where electrical engineers and the like need to say, right, our apprenticeships and the like need to think and know different things, think differently and know different things. I think thinking about time frame is really important. My own feeling is that the writing is on the wall, and so we need to be thinking now about what those skills and requirements will be. And Dr. Pratt spoke yesterday about the ideal person. And who'll take ownership of whatever strategy it is that needs to be developed so that Australia's electricity industry can support this brave new world. Right? Which organisation does that? And I'm being approached from behind. Thank you.
Okay. You talked about at Actu AGL, the upper management was all over it, next level, bit of a problem, further down you got. Let's go further down than that. What about to the consumer? How do we get to impart this kind of information to them?
I think so. The consumer is an interesting one because there is no one single consumer, right? And as I alluded to earlier on, Canberra is full of highly educated and relatively wealthy individuals. Not all of them, but many of them. That's why we were just voted the best city to live in. One of the key criteria was disposable income. Not doing any favours for the Australian Public Service here. But those kind of consumers are going to embrace it fairly quickly. And that's why we had the massive proliferation, I think, or the unexpected proliferation of panels. Then there are going to be other consumers that just simply aren't in a position to embrace a new technology. One of the things that's so unfair about rebates is that you actually, it is systemically skewed towards wealthy people. Right? And it will be the same with storage, even though frankly it's the people who need to really be keeping an eye on tariff rates that should be afforded the opportunity to store their technology, store their energy and use it when tariffs are high. I mean, it is systemically inequitable. So, I think there's two ends of the spectrum. And ideally, you'd have a government that saw that.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, for the presentation. David Neal, sort of a consultant at EOS, but I also wear another hat. I am part of a community lobby group on the southeast of New South Wales called Clean Energy for Eternity. Yep. So we've had a keen interest in this topic for a long time. In a number of the presentations so far, we've heard this story that the model of the prosumer will be challenged because people won't understand it enough to be able to apply it. Yet I'm aware of a technology, a software solution coming out of Canberra, which actually puts the intelligence into the system so the consumer doesn't really need to worry about it. In any of your modelling, in any of your research, did you look at those sorts of systems and how they could be applied as well?
No, I didn't. Although I have a copy of this week's Economist on the table over there, and there's a really interesting article around mini grids, and essentially what they're saying is that in the United States, they're integrated. They have an NEM that doesn't look like an NEM. It's just a dog's breakfast of an integrated system, and so they are constantly suffering outages, particularly from natural hazards like cyclones. So there's this development of mini grids where universities, prisons, military sites, they're taking themselves off that ridiculously poorly managed grid, and they're saying, right, we're going to generate our own energy, and we're going to store our own energy, and we're going to do it because it fits our needs, right? And they outsource some of it back to the supplier, like the equivalent of Actu, and they pay a premium for that because they're prepared to, it's security of supply. But the same article said that in concert with this shift towards mini grids is the development of software to support it, right? So that you can actually, within the mini grid, you have it operating differently according to your different needs. And I instantly thought of my office building, which is one of these 6-star environmentally friendly things, and I can set my air conditioner temperature to whatever I like, and the guy next to me has his at a different setting. I think we're going to find software that enables us to be incredibly self-sufficient at the touch of a keypad. So self-sufficient without needing the intelligence to actually understand it, because you just have an app to make it happen. I think that's going to happen. But just as everybody thought the internet was going to completely and fundamentally revolutionize retail, and it hasn't. This is another article in The Economist as of today. I think there's going to be a parallel shift. Parallel developments. You're still going to have people who just want to see their meter and get their bill, and they don't want it online. And then you're going to have really savvy people who have the whole thing automated.
We can take one more question at the back behind you.
Thanks, Karen. Ian Neeson, I consult with EOS. Look, the general impression I got from your presentation was the biggest stumbling block seemed to be the social, cultural, political climate that we're in.
Yep.
That was, I think the technology is going to take care of itself in some ways.
Yep.
Is that the general overall?
Yeah, absolutely. Laws can be changed, technical standards can be developed, right? Training programs can be developed. The economics is going to take care of itself because the technology is becoming more and more mature. What is much harder is shifting mindsets. And some of the utilities are fighting tooth and nail to slow down the penetration of renewable energy technologies and supplement that storage. And it's because they're scared out of their minds, and rightly so. So it's a push and pull, really. I think you're going to have consumers saying, I want to be able to do this because it's a good thing to do, or because it's a cost-effective thing to do, or both. And the utilities are just going to be forced into reacting to that. But that's the hardest thing to do.